Thank you all for joining us today for a webinar discussing the findings of the EFI Foundation's newly published report on how communities can navigate binding agreements around clean energy development. Our report outlines how community representatives can navigate binding agreements in ways that create a fair and equitable outcome for all parties while bringing benefits like local development and environmental protection. We will discuss the findings of the report and will speak with experts on environmental justice, community organizing, and contract negotiation. And now for opening remarks from EFIF Director of Research, Dr. Madeline Schomburg. Madeline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for an important conversation on negotiating binding agreements in clean energy projects. My name is Madeline Schomburg. I'm the Director of Research here at the EFI Foundation, where our mission is to accelerate the clean energy transition through data-driven policy and coalition building. We firmly believe that clean energy project progress goes hand in hand with the support and involvement of local communities. Over the past 2 years, we've engaged in extensive work on community-centered initiatives with a particular focus on the hydrogen hub. Many of you may already be familiar with our ongoing work in this space. Hopefully, you've seen the 3 fact books that we've previously released on community engagement in hydrogen. And the work we're going to present to you today is an extension of that project. I would like to clarify briefly, however, that the binding agreements we're going to be talking about today were not written by hydrogen hubs or by any hydrogen project, but rather by analogous energy sectors. The goal of our research was to utilize lessons learned from previously negotiated binding agreements, of which there are none to our knowledge already in existence in hydrogen. But we wanted to be able to help inform those processes as they begin to play out in hydrogen and potentially in the hydrogen hub. One of the reasons we prioritized this particular vein of research is because in our last survey, we gathered insights into the priorities that matter most to communities. And one of the issues that rose to the very top was community interest on research on how to go about creating a binding agreement with hydrogen developers. Our work has shown us that binding agreements aren't just legal documents, but critical tools for building trust and accountability in community relationships. When agreements are thoughtfully crafted with community voices front and center, they can pave the way for more inclusive and long-lasting partnerships. And we've seen that when communities have a say in negotiations, projects benefit from greater public support, clearer frameworks for accountability, and better foundations for future projects. So in today's discussion, we'll take a closer look at how to structure and negotiate binding agreements in a way that creates a more equitable process and hopefully leads to a more successful agreement that reflects the values of the community it impacts. By sharing what we've learned, we hope to provide communities with tools and insights that they can utilize as they enter new negotiations and advocate for their own priorities. So thank you again to all of you for being here and for your commitment to advancing clean energy partnerships. We hope you leave today with some practical knowledge you can bring to your own negotiations. And I'd like to also thank the project team who carried out this work. Beth Dowdy led a lot of the research, and you'll be hearing from her in a moment. And she was supported by a fantastic group of people here, including Maddie Cohen and Divine Madakulam. And with that, let's get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Madeline. And now for an overview of our report led by EFI Foundation Research Associate, Beth Dowdy.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you all. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, and we'll go ahead and get started. So, as Madeline mentioned, the goal of this report was really to lay out expectations for communities that are entering into binding agreement negotiations within the Hydrogen Hubs program, but really within the larger clean energy ecosystem. So folks that are interested in pursuing these sorts of agreements. We do know that binding agreements have been around for a long time in various sectors, but the presence is growing in clean energy. So from mining projects in the early 2000s to now seeing a growing presence in wind, the reach of these agreements is really extending. As Madeline mentioned, as far as we know, these are not used in current hydrogen projects, but we're hoping that the lessons learned are applicable to new audiences. So how did we do this? We held over 24 interviews across 9 different agreements in analogous sectors. This includes mining, wind, solar, etc. We also attended convenings with experts in this space and had conversations, one-on-one conversations with experts in this field. The interviews were conducted virtually, and the ultimate goal was to know what worked and what didn't to reach a signed agreement. So what did that process look like? How often were you meeting? Where were you meeting? Who was in the room? All of these conversations were anonymous to really promote an open dialogue and to learn more about what these processes looked like. These are not best practices, as Madeline mentioned. Rather, these are expectations from lessons learned from other negotiations. So we really wanted to be able to demystify a process that might otherwise be seen as opaque to hopefully enable more effective negotiations between communities and developers. Now that you know all of this kind of scene setting, I want to provide the types that we focused on. So the 3 types that we focused on, I'll start with community benefits agreements. We also looked at good neighbor agreements. And finally, we looked at host community agreements. These agreements were self-defined. So essentially, whatever the agreement called themselves, that's what we took it as. Besides one agreement, which we did re-bucket in order to maintain the confidentiality of the participants within that agreement. What I'm going to talk to today are really patterns across these agreements, so they're not definitions. We know that there are a lot of questions from experts in this field on how to define these buckets. In fact, we don't even really know how many of these agreements exist. So I'm going to show a few patterns that emerged for us, but we really encourage a dialogue from folks that may be on this webinar today on cases in which maybe yours differed and you want to sort of talk through what your process looked like. So really hope that engagement comes through. So we'll start with community benefits agreements. For these agreements, we spoke to project developers, community coalitions or organizations, and local government. Those were the 3 main buckets of folks that we spoke to that were involved in these negotiations. For good neighbor agreements, we spoke again to those same sort of 3 buckets of community members, but we also spoke to landowners that were in proximity to these projects to try to understand what that looks like for individuals that are aiming to be compensated through these agreements, what that looked like for landowners. And then finally, for host community agreements, we did find that local government really played an outsized role within these agreements. We know that these are the people we spoke with, but there are a ton of other agreement types that you might pursue. For example, project labor agreements bring wonderful benefits to organized labor, but we wanted to focus specifically on non-unionized folks, so people that hadn't really done this before, perhaps. So hopefully that the findings from these engagements can be applied into new spaces where people might be doing this for the first time. So we'll get into what some of those findings were. We tried to do this in what we saw as a somewhat familiar framework. So who was involved, what, when, where, and how. The why is also, of course, very important. And I think Madeline pointed to a bit at the introduction. It's also outlined in the introduction of our report. So I encourage you to go engage with that there. We'll start with who. We found that smaller groups of local representatives usually met with the developer first. Often what this looked like was if larger groups entered into the negotiation space first, it could lead to some conflict around what the priorities were for the community. Instead, communities would leverage community leaders to start that conversation and then bring those priorities and those conversations to a larger group later on to ensure that there's still transparency within the process. Local government was often a key player, so they may play a role as a moderator. They might be the main negotiator, but they were present across all of our cases. Next, the what. We found that parties tended to agree on broader goals. So things like what environmental protection might look like for a particular project, or what community benefits programs are being prioritized. Those were somewhat easier to get through within the negotiation process. But there were other specifics like where exactly the project might be located, what benefit allocation might look like. Those required more conversation. So if there were multiple parties involved, you might have to have a longer session or a few sessions about how to allocate various benefits across different parties and what that's going to look like. We found across the board that legal expertise and negotiation skills were essential. So I think on the face of it, this might look like the same thing, but I think it's important to emphasize for the interviewees that we spoke with, these were actually 2 very distinct things. So formal negotiation skills were really pointed to as a space where communities prioritize maybe a third party coming in to negotiate on behalf of the community and move the process along. Also, developers could provide funding for communities to go identify a negotiation training where they could become skilled on negotiating on their own behalf. So having that distinct perspective was really important in the negotiation at the negotiation table. Legal representation was also very important. So these are legal contracts. So having a lawyer present was extremely important to ensure that these agreements were implementable. When? The timeline for these negotiations varied. I will say consistently, we found that there was an average around 2 years that these agreements took to negotiate and reach the point of a signed agreement. But more frequent meetings often led to faster resolution. This might seem like a little bit of a no-brainer, but I think it's important to note that the length of these meetings could be several hours. So if you're meeting weekly to try and reach an agreement quicker, it's important to have that foundation of understanding that that will sort of be the expectation if you want to reach something a bit quicker, so that communities have the opportunity to build capacity and make sure that they have a voice in the room that's able to be there consistently and negotiate on their behalf. Next, where? These were some of my favorite conversations to have. We found that meetings often had a mix of formal sessions and informal sessions. So formal sessions might be something like sitting in a conference room with an agenda, having someone transcribe the meeting so that it's able to be shared with the broader community. But there were also informal gatherings. So after a formal gathering, perhaps you go get a meal. This was really important for communities to establish a bit of relationship building with the developer. So for both parties to be able to start to build that trust amongst one another. These agreements are hopefully going to be long lasting. And so it's important to have sort of the trust inherent between the two parties so that the timeline together can be a bit more productive and there can be sort of a trusting foundation moving forward. Finally, the how. So we found that within these agreements and within project development, it was important to point to the fact that companies may change over the life cycle of the project. So the company that you're talking to today about this agreement, they might not be the same in 2 weeks. It might not be the same in 2 years. So making sure that your agreement is resilient through those changes was extremely important for our interviewees. What this may look like, one option was to tie the agreement to something like a land covenant, where the project will be located. Another was to tie it to something like a project permit. That way it was resilient through company changes and other unexpected events. And finally, as you all can probably imagine, if there are a lot of voices at the table, there's going to be conflict internally as well. So communities might have differing ideas between one another about what the priorities are and what benefits they want to push forward as the negotiation process proceeds. So having strategic pauses to step back and align internally was really important for a lot of our interviewees to reach the point of a signed agreement in the end. I'll pause there and say a big thank you, especially to our interviewees. It was incredibly wonderful to get to know all of the folks that were involved in these agreements. And hopefully this offers an opportunity to sort of leverage the knowledge that they gave to us, to others. The project team was incredible to work with, and we really encourage you all to go engage with the report. If you have any questions about the findings or want to know more details, I'm of course always happy to talk through that, and we can dive into that a bit in the panel as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Beth. We will now be joined by Sharon Lewis, who is the Executive Director at the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice, by Julian Gross, who is the Principal at the Law Office of Julian Gross, and by Annie Contractor, who is the Policy Director at Rural Organizing, for a panel moderated by Madeline Schomburg. Madeline, over to you.
Great, thank you. I would invite the panelists to all please, thank you, turn on your cameras if you're able to join us. And I think we'll just start by having you introduce yourselves a bit and tell us about your experience with binding agreements. How have you interfaced with them? What are your kind of thoughts, generally speaking? And I guess I will call on Julian first. Sorry.
It's okay. Thanks, Madeline, and thanks to EFI for hosting this and for doing all this work, and to Beth for that great overview of the report. So I'm an attorney based in San Francisco, and my role in these things is to represent community coalitions or occasionally local government in actually negotiating these agreements. So that's, you know, a certain very specific kind of lens on these, but, you know, it has enabled me to work on a lot of different kinds of projects and with a lot of different kinds of coalitions. But I rarely get to sort of step back and get a really good, you know, assessment from the participants on the coalition side of what worked and what different it didn't. So I think the report's going to be really helpful in that regard. So I think I'll leave it at that and get the other panelists in the mix, and we'll get a lot of back and forth in the discussion, I'm sure.
Great. Annie, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the welcome. My name is Annie Contractor. I'm the policy director at Rural Organizing, and I'm trained as a regional planner. And our organization supports local activists and organizers who are really in a place of trying to respond to this new space of energy development across the country. So we've been sort of adjacent to a few different community benefits plan negotiations or agreement negotiations, but mostly we are in a position of being approached by folks who know they're going to be approached to say, how can we get ready for this? How can we be in a good negotiating position when this comes to us? And so we've been working with folks who, you know, are in communities that have gotten recent federal awards, and that process is rapidly spinning up. Communities that might have negotiated something and they're trying to figure out how they can share those lessons with other communities. Particularly, there's one community that worked on a CO2 pipeline, and they were successfully able to negotiate a CBA, and they're wanting to make sure that they're able to share those lessons across communities. And then also folks who are just, you know, in the path where we can see that development's coming, and we really want folks to be resourced so that they're not caught in a poor negotiating position. So that's sort of where I come into this, and we've spent about 18 months trying to build resources for communities in those situations. I'm excited to hear from Sharon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sharon Lewis, Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice. Our organization has been involved in 3 very important binding agreements with power plants and other polluters, one in New Haven, Connecticut, one in Waterbury, Connecticut, and the biggest one in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with the PSEG power plant. We work with people to develop meaningful binding agreements. We assist them with understanding the legalese. We sometimes train people to understand that the negotiation process is not a quick one. It's very, very long. We work with groups to make sure that the community is on the same page and is aware of what's going on and is in agreement with some of these community benefits plans. We're very, very concerned about what the developers produce in the area of community benefits plans. So it's a very difficult job. We feel often pressured by the Department of Energy to be prepared to accept and review and develop community benefits plans, but many of us don't even know what they are, don't know all that it entails. So it's just a very difficult job for us, but we're proceeding. There is a new National Community Benefits Alliance that has just started, and I'm very happy to say that on one of our calls, we share information about communicating with the developers, share information with different types of binding agreements, share information about the types of community benefits agreements that are more beneficial. So I will stop there because I don't want to dominate the whole conversation, but our role is just to make sure that people develop the meaningful community benefits agreements that are relatable and meaningful to them and their community.
I love your use of the word meaningful there. And, you know, one of the things that people have asked us a lot after we produced this report is, are these best practices? And we've continued to say, no, they're not best practices. We were very deliberate about that in the report, that this is a description of what we observed rather than a normative statement on what should happen. And we did that because as we sat down and we dug through our data, we had a really hard time deciding, well, is this the way that it should go? Is this a good thing? Or is this just what happens and what works? And so I'm curious, as you think about a meaningful process and getting to a meaningful agreement, are there sets of best practices that can be developed? And what would be on that list? Or is it simply an area where there's too much individuality or uniqueness to each scenario to come up with a set of statements about how it should proceed?
Well, that's one of the things that we're trying to do with the Community Benefits Alliance, listening to people all across the country to figure out what they consider best practices. I will tell you now that there are two things that we are considering to be best practices. One is what we call the Sankofa clause, where we would look back to see what we left behind. It's very important because in Connecticut, for example, with what we thought were successful binding agreements, but by not looking back, we didn't realize what we left behind. So we need to have Sankofa clauses in all these binding agreements. And also we need succession liability insurance to make sure that in the event the developer leaves town or doesn't do what they say what they're going to do, that the community is protected and that the benefits that they negotiated will continue on.
I would say, just if I could jump in, I think if there's probably a bunch of different ways to ask that question of sort of what are the best practices. So if you're a community-based organization or coalition trying to sort of fight your way to the table to get traction to negotiate a binding agreement, there's probably a lot of things, especially that the organizers would recommend for your advocacy approach, the different capacities your coalition will need, how you work together and stay united, etc. If you're actually at the table in negotiations, there are also a sort of set of recommended approaches or approaches that have worked well in other situations that could be adapted to whatever you're doing for, how how many people you bring to negotiations, how to ensure that whoever is sort of at the table in negotiations has clear sort of authorization and instructions from the full coalition and set of decision makers about, positions they can take and so forth, how the full coalition can make rapid decisions that they're all comfortable with about things that are, presented, positions to be taken or responded to in the negotiations, how you could work with your lawyer. If you're a lawyer doing this, there's a different set of sort of best practices of things like successor liability, as Sharon mentioned, in how you would write this up, what your legal duties, what your professional responsibilities are as a lawyer to the various coalition members, some of whom you may be formally representing and some of whom you might not be representing, as well as a lot of stuff about the language and the clauses. And then, finally, if you are a public entity that has approval rights or permit applications you're considering, or you're engaged in negotiation with a project developer, the way Department of Energy is on all their funding agreements that they're doing, or if you're a local government and negotiating a development agreement or a land deal or a lease or something, how you would be sure you're taking into account community and public perspectives on the project, both in terms of go, no go, or there may be just opposition. There might be a lot of constituents in your jurisdiction that just think it's a bad project. Or, if it does go forward, what they'd like to see in that project in terms of mitigation and benefits. So there's best practices there too. So I think there's, so many players in these things and each of them have different roles. And, there probably are recommended approaches or things that have worked well, depending on what your role is in the stage in the process. So long non-answer, maybe, I'm not sure.
I think what I would add to what Sharon and Julian have added here is that as you said at the top of the call, binding agreements aren't really new. So even though sort of this iteration feels new, we have a lot of history to look back on to say, what do we wish those had done differently? And I think the one thing, although you could get into lots of specifics about what should be in agreements and how you set up, you know, the who's at the table conversations, which I think are important considerations, but maybe to like get to a values, a starting place is to look back at that history of these negotiations and look at the differential in the negotiating power and really make an effort from both sides to start by trying to equalize that negotiating power so that when you're getting to an agreement, you're actually getting to an agreement that everyone is happy with, or, you know, to the best degree possible. And I think we can learn from the past where maybe in some cases it was unintentional and in some cases it felt abusive. But developers who want to do a good thing can really start by saying, we recognize that right now we have the money, we have the federal policy backing, we have the statutory constraints to develop. Communities often don't even have an awareness of what's going on. So let's start by trying to equalize that power and then go into a negotiation where we're actually on equal footing and not going to move forward until everyone feels like they're getting a good deal. So getting to that win-win from an equal place.
You've all kind of raised the issue now of the various stakeholders and players in the room and who's a part of it. And one of the things that we've, excuse me, bumped into again and again is trying to figure out, how do you know if you have all of the right people at the table? And what do you do if you don't? How do you either rectify it or just accept it? And so I'd love to hear your perspectives, particularly yours, Sharon, and how do you make sure that you're representing all of the people in your quote unquote community, which we know, of course, has a lot of different ways of defining it. And if you don't think you are, what do you do about that?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, and I'm also not happy that you asked the question because it's a very difficult question. For example, the Bridgeport situation with PSEG, that was my first one. We didn't know what we were doing. It wasn't a situation where we started the negotiation process. We were invited. I was invited to sit at the table. So I had no choice in the matter. I was not able to choose the folks who were part of this Citizens Advisory Committee that worked to negotiate the agreement. But I made sure, or I tried to make sure, that as many meaningful stakeholders were at the table. It was very difficult because there were just so many seats at the table available, and not everyone was welcomed. So it's just really hard when you are an invitee to the table. It wasn't my table, it was somebody else's table. And I often worried about people who were not invited, who should have been at that table. It's a very difficult question because I never know when, if we ever had enough, or I could never know if we were able to include everyone. I'm looking to Julian to help with this, but Julian, have there ever been situations where communities or groups have felt comfortable with the representation at the table?
There may have been situations like that, but I think they're few and far between because of the incredible diversity of perspectives within any community around a big, important project that affects a lot of stakeholders and is going to change a community for decades. So I think it's worth noting that at least in the first 20 years of things that were called community benefits agreements usually in the urban land use sector. So the sort of range of agreements that I think contributed to the phrase being very prominent and this tool being more prominent. In none of those cases did the public entity say, here are the community groups that are the valid community representatives, and we are empowering them to negotiate a CBA. So when my experience has been that when an elected official or a public entity tries to do that, and sort of designate some groups as representative of the whole community, that is a road to failure. It's sort of guaranteed to fail, and I'm not sure it's even a legitimate process for government. So, you know, if you just take like a city council, different city council members are going to have different opinions as to which community perspectives they think are valid and important, and that's okay. But it also that process of sort of formal public designation of the valid community representatives is very often used, in my experience, to actually push aside a set of representatives that have a different view from the ones that are being designated as the valid representatives. So I think that's sort of a dead end if we're trying to advance the sort of highest purposes of these kind of agreements and negotiations. Because it's sort of, as much as it might feel like it should be inclusive, it's also exclusive of the groups that aren't designated. So all those good agreements that as I say, sort of led to this tool being so prominent, the groups sort of self-selected by fighting their way to the table, by building credibility, by being pretty broad in terms of, you know, being willing to bring other groups into the coalition, but not so broad that the coalition made no sense and couldn't negotiate in a coherent manner or had fundamentally different views about a project. And, you know, they were, you know, raising valid community needs, but not in a self-interested way. And those are the sort of dynamics that I've seen in coalitions that lead to them being taken seriously and given weight in the process, you know, and sort of building their own leverage. So I think, you know, you've got to sort of fight your way to the table by being civic-minded, by being inclusive, but not by pretending that everyone is going to have the same position and you can represent everybody.
I find it amazing that you chose the words "fight your way to the table," because that's exactly what I went through. And I still have my battle scars.
I bet.
Yeah. Go ahead, Amy.
The only thing I think I have to add to those lived experiences, because I haven't done that exact thing, comes from my time working on the COVID-19 response and seeing, working with advocacy groups who were really demanding that the public health response recognize the work that those communities had already done to set priorities and to create the infrastructure through which public initiatives could reach them. And so I think this is a little bit aspirational rather than based in an example that has happened on the ground. But one of the ways that we could do this differently is to start by doing our research with demographics and community groups that already exist, and, you know, really diving into what already is out there about those priorities. You know, look at faith groups that have strategic plans. Look at community action groups that have a set of priorities that they're working on their websites. Go to, you know, community meetings at the very local level and hear what sort of things are coming up. Read their minutes so that you can see what people are giving public comment about. There's actually a lot of content out there for us to understand what are priorities that are coming up in communities, that we could do a better job not asking particularly overburdened parts of the community to do the work over and over again, but start with what information is already there, the work that those communities have already done to say what they need and to find the people who need to be at the negotiating table. Again, I think that's a little aspirational, but it's an option in front of us.
Absolutely. Julian, since you have been a part of so many of these or seen so many of them, could you point to one that you think maybe has been particularly effective? And I'm not talking about the agreement itself and what was in it so much as the process of getting there. One that you think would be an example to hold up.
Oh, I'm not sure I want to just pick one. You know, my experience is more heavy in the urban land use setting, where there have been a bunch of very prominent, you know, well-studied models, like, of course, the sort of Staples LA Live one, which was the most famous one. It's been written up innumerable times from 2002. that's really, that was a great one in terms of, the number of groups that were there and the true win-win outcomes and, actual implementation with the project being built. But there's been so many different incarnations of it. I do feel like in the clean energy sector, we're really seeing a new application of this. And I know there have been binding agreements in the past in energy development, as I think has already been mentioned. But the sort of robust vision of a community benefits agreement, a la these urban ones, I think are sort of fewer and farther between in the clean energy side. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the urban-rural distinction, maybe Annie might be able to speak to that a little bit and how those dynamics change. The more heavy environmental aspects, because you're building in maybe more sensitive areas for some of these things, or at least less urbanized areas. And fewer stakeholders, less local capacity, more eagerness for local development. I think there are a bunch of aspects that make it more challenging in the clean energy sector. The one other factor I would mention is that many of these big clean energy projects are really like multiple projects rolled together. Like, you look at like an offshore wind project, you've got the federal government leasing to one developer, but then you might have onshore development being done by a logistics company, and then you might need transmission lines through sensitive areas being advanced by the state. So it's like a blend of private development that the public is facilitating and public infrastructure development, all with different timelines and approval processes needing separate negotiations. So it can be pretty daunting. So I'm all ears for like, what are the best examples of these things in the clean energy space? So I'm looking forward to getting into your report, and I'd certainly like to take a look at the agreements that Sharon and her team have negotiated in Connecticut. I haven't seen those, but they sound really, really great.
Yeah, to your point about rural and urban distinctions, I have a couple of comments there. We have lots of information. People are rapidly trying to poll opinions and things like that. The vast majority of people, including in rural communities, are interested in renewable energy. They're supportive of renewable energy development, but generally, folks just don't want to get raked over the coals. They don't want to feel like their power is taken away. They don't want to feel like something's shoved down their throats. And when you start to parse that a little bit farther, when you look at communities that oppose renewable energy development, they tend to be some of the wealthiest and whitest communities. So there's a narrative about rural communities, which make up about 1/5 of the US population. So, 1 in 5 people live in a rural community that they kind of don't know what's good for them, and that they're a barrier or they're a hindrance to renewable energy development. But really, that opposition is coming from a pretty particular place. And so that's one thing I think it's important to be aware of. But I also do want, I am really empathetic to the idea that, there does need to be this shared co-creation of these projects in a way that's actually going to benefit communities. Rural communities are not a monolith. That's another mistake that we make in this space, is thinking about that 1/5 of the US population as all the same. But there are tourism economies, there are ag economies, there are super remote communities, there are tribal communities, there are Black Belt communities that have been disinvested for decades, if not centuries. And so there's some really important differences in the history of energy development in each of these different types of communities, and what those negotiations need to look like have to be different and responsive to the situation that they're in. But there are also some important commonalities, and I'm sorry, Madeline, I don't think I'm answering your question about what works, but some of the commonalities in rural communities include, what makes something rural is a smaller population. And smaller populations have very direct relationships with smaller revenue streams for public goods. And so there are these real fiscal constraints on rural communities and their ability to provide that base of public goods for their community in a way that you don't have the same kinds of fiscal constraints in some of the urban and suburban communities that these projects might be getting developed in. And so as you were saying, Julian, some of the pressure to say yes can be even stronger when you feel like maybe this is the only option on the table for us. And so even if we're not getting a good deal, we might feel like we have to say yes. And so I'm going to go back to what I said first in the last question, which is if we can really try to acknowledge the existing power imbalance and try to right that power piece first and say, we recognize there's this difference. So let's really try to make sure that we come out with a win-win that's actually going to be beneficial for everybody. That's something that's rural communities are going to have less leverage to do because of some of those fiscal structure pieces.
Thank you both. And since you raised the point, Annie, about the sort of uniqueness of different scenarios, Sharon, I would love to hear more about your particular experience in the agreements that you were a part of, and perhaps particularly thinking about what surprised you the most that you wish you had known beforehand.
Oh my God, my experience was quite horrific, to be honest with you. I didn't know what to expect, but the most difficult thing that I had to deal with was the fact that I was surprised by the extreme opposition from not only the community, but also within our own coalition. Only one of us was invited to the table, and that one of us was me. There was jealousy within the coalition. There were people in the organization who did not want me at that table. There were people in the community who did not want, it's not that they didn't want me at the table, but they wanted other folks in addition to me at the table. They were very upset that I was not willing or able to give them a daily report about all of the negotiations. It was they felt that everything was done in the dark and it wasn't transparent when that just wasn't correct. But the bottom line is I was very, very surprised by the opposition of folks who literally came in and disrupted meetings. People who talked about me in the newspaper and on television, and it was pretty nasty. And that's where I got most of my battle scars from. Totally surprised by that.
I'm sorry you had to go through that. That does sound like a terrible experience. And I'm curious, though, what strategies did you use to try to deal with some of that, particularly if there were things being offered and your coalition was not all aligned on how to respond to that? What did you do?
Well, the only thing I could do, and of course, because it being a surprise, I was not prepared for this, but I went out of my way to tell folks that, the process is transparent. I tried to tell them as much as I could because being at the table, we had to agree to keep most of the information we were discussing confidential. There were like 10 or 12 different versions of the CBA. So I think it would be very reckless for me to release all of these different versions to the community and further confuse people about what we were actually negotiating. I like I say, I was totally surprised by this. Didn't know how to respond. Did the best I could to convince people that it wasn't a secret deal and told them as much as I can. Transparency is very important. And I had to make sure that everything that I did was transparent and that there was no look of or no action that I took that would give people the impression that it wasn't transparent.
You raised a really important point that actually was reflected in a question we got from the audience. So I think I'll pose that question now. They asked, a lot of these agreements are negotiated in private and are not shared widely with the public due to reluctance from both developers and hesitancy from the community and labor side. How can transparency around the use of these agreements and what's in them be increased, especially when both parties want to keep negotiations and the actual agreements private?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat that question?
Sure. I think in sum, the question is how can transparency and around the agreement and what's in it be increased, especially if both sides are sort of interested in keeping it private?
Well, I think Julian, you started to answer that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have some strong thoughts on this, strong opinions, I should say. So I feel like this transparency is one of the core values of the community benefits movement and a fundamental aspect of a CBA that should be taken seriously. So that doesn't mean, you can conduct CBA negotiations in public, but a final agreement that constitutes the basis of community support and is being presented by developers or unions or whoever, or as a rationale for supporting the project and the community benefits that are going to be provided. To me, that it's just fundamental that has to be transparent, or the agreement is not really deserving of, shouldn't be taken into account very heavily when considering the project or the value of the CBA. So I'm looking at the questions in the chat, and two of these questions, the one from William and the one from Samantha, sort of both go to how should we look at and evaluate a particular CBA? How can we assess whether it is, meaningfully advancing the purposes of a CBA or benefiting the project and the public? So there's no litmus test, and some of this is going to be in the eye of the beholder. But I would take it back to the fundamental purposes and values of what we're trying to do here, and I think of those as four things: inclusivity, meaning there has to be a broad input. It has to be shaped by a broad range of community perspectives and community members. Transparency, meaning if the public can't know what you're doing, I think it should be almost completely disregarded. Accountability, meaning these things need to be legally enforceable, or what are we doing here? And finally, equity. These agreements are supposed to advance social and economic equity, those aspects of the project. And I feel like whether an agreement is negotiated between the public entity and the developer, or between some community groups, but not all of them, and the developer, regardless of the particulars of it, I think everyone can look back and say, is this agreement, in your opinion, advancing those purposes or not? Or is it really a deal that's just, good for the people who signed it? Maybe they're getting some money for their programs. I would say that if you're negotiating an agreement, but you're not comfortable making it public, I guess if I was a member of the public, I would pretty much disregard that agreement if I'm, being asked to take it seriously. So I think that's a fundamental value.
Well, let me also add one thing too about the transparency. I was a part of a larger coalition that included my organization, and the coalition was very instrumental in contributing to the actual parts of the community benefits agreement. So let's say you have 7 different groups within the coalition. All of those groups have community members and other folks and other stakeholders that they were fully working with and fully aware of. So a large part of the community was involved in everything that we did. But unfortunately, there were people who just wanted to be where we were, wanted to be in my seat. And it was very difficult for me to understand why that was such a hotly debated situation, since I run the largest environmental justice organization in the state of Connecticut. And of the coalition that I was in, I believe that I was the only Connecticut-based organization. So when I talk about the folks who were fighting within, almost everyone was out of state, and they didn't like the fact that the city of Bridgeport chose an in-state organization to be at the table. And that just spread like a disease to other community members who also felt that they should be at the table. So I ask you, Julian, if there are only 12 seats at the table, how do you deal with people who don't agree with folks who are at that table?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I would question the fundamentals of, you know, someone establishing a table and saying how many seats are there and starting to assign and invite some people and not others, right? Like that whole process is not, to my mind, you know, moving us toward the, you know, a strong CBA.
You are correct.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that, you know, we didn't realize. You know, like I said, it was actually my first one. And we didn't realize how important that was. We didn't realize that when the city decided there were only going to be 12 seats, that it would cause such issues within the community.
Yeah, going back to one of the questions in the chat. So Gavin had asked about hub level advisory panels in community benefits planning. What are the thoughts about effectiveness of this kind of structure? I guess I would say that kind of structure, an advisory body that's going to get information and hold public meetings and everyone is going to get to say things and express their opinion. That is better than not having one of those things, but nothing like an accountability mechanism that can really, you know, shape these things. I mean, they're fundamentally advisory. Every project known to mankind has had advisory panels. In the best case scenario, they're an important component of transparency around project development. In the worst case scenario, they're a place to stick all the busybodies so that they can have a bunch of meetings and give them all meeting fatigue and vent their public participation capacity in a totally advisory manner that doesn't actually affect anything.
+1 about advisory committees that don't vote on anything.
Yeah.
I mean, you can vote on recommendations, but if you don't have power, it's a waste of time. And it's a white supremacist structure to push people off to the side so that another negotiation can happen over here. That's my perspective of a lot of advisory committees. I think that that's not always true, but in many cases it is. And to the point about structural disadvantage, Sharon, you were sharing about what surprised you, and what it really sounds to me like is that this is a symptom of a scarcity mindset, which I can forgive so many people for being in a scarcity mindset, right? A feeling that, you know, this might be the only thing that we can grab a hold of, that our community has not had investment, or has not had, you know, an opportunity to create new jobs, or has not had the opportunity for a community development fund or whatever it is for so long. You know, we kind of have to get ours. But I think that one of the opportunities on the table here, developers need the social license to operate. They need your approval. So communities, one of the things I would like to get into the conversation today is don't give away your power because you hold it. Communities hold power here, and don't give it away. Because that's one of the big gifts of these community benefits structures that have come out of federal policy recently, is to say communities have to have a voice here, and you have the power to stop agreements. And we've seen reports from the Department of Energy themselves that say that the lack of social acceptance is holding projects back. So I saw this in the report as well, that taking strategic pauses to get community coalitions better aligned when there is that internal disagreement is a way that I think communities can exercise that power. And I think we can take this moment to push back on that pillar of white supremacy that is scarcity, that there's not enough to go around. Actually, there is enough to go around, and we can pause and say, we're not going to go faster than we can agree. And I think that's like, it's kind of like feel good and a little bit in the sky, theoretical, but I think there's an opportunity on the table to think about that through an abundance mindset, so that we can create those stronger coalitions that say, what if you could get everything you want? How do we go to the table with that negotiating power?
And do you all think that community benefits agreements or other types of binding agreements then are the best mechanism in order to confer benefits on communities? Is that the way that we should prioritize over something like advisory committees, or are there other things that you would recommend instead, and why?
I don't think that the name of the agreement matters as long as it has the components like Julian was talking about, that it's legally enforceable, that there's the resources to hold the agreement holders accountable, that there is this capacity on both sides, and the true intent and the legal accountability, the legal enforceability to make it happen. I mean, whether it's a good neighbor agreement or a host community agreement or a community benefits agreement, I don't think the name matters as long as it's enforceable.
Well, I have a situation that I'm struggling with in Connecticut and Bridgeport, for example. The settlement from PSEG through the Community Benefits Agreement was $15 million. And that was deal was signed in 2016, February 1st, in fact. Problem is, the money is being managed by people who were appointed by the mayor of the city of Bridgeport, and not a single dollar was used for the purposes intended.
I think I would say the CBA is definitely not the right tool for every project. By CBA, I'm just meaning a private agreement between community representatives and the developer. You know, if you just oppose a project, this is not the tool for you, right? This is a tool to improve a project, and then it'll move forward and deliver the benefits, right? But if you just think a project is a bad project, then you know, CBA negotiations are not your tool. In the narrow settings where if you are a community coalition and you want to, you know, you think a project is a good project or potentially a good project, but you really want to see community benefits out of it, then it's a really good mechanism in that you know, get to say yes or no to the terms, and you can enforce it over time. You're not dependent on, you know, the future administrations of some public entity to enforce commitments over time. You actually have the legal ability to do that. I think it is a very valid tool that can provide that in those circumstances where that's your perspective on the project and you have the power to win an agreement like that. There are a huge number of projects all over the country where those preconditions are not going to be met, but nonetheless, the public is providing huge amounts of money to the project. Most obviously in all the many US DOE projects that are being funded, the clean energy projects. And in those cases, it is, even though there may not be a private community benefits agreement, it is absolutely incumbent on DOE and potentially local permitting authorities to negotiate a good slate of community benefits.
I think we lost you, Julian. So I have one last question as we chug towards the end here. We've seen a bunch of things come in through the chat, people asking, what's the first step? To your point, Andy, how do I go about leveling that playing field? I wanted to ask, you know, what piece of advice do you have? So if we could kind of blend that all together, you know, pick which piece of that you want to speak to, but what's the piece of advice, or what's the first step? How should somebody watching this who may be in the position of being part of one of these agreements or negotiations start to think about tackling that?
Is that for me first? I think Sharon should go first.
Well, one of the things that we do, that we're doing right now, in the absence of a situation where we would have to come up with a CBA, is we are working to educate folks. We're working to train folks to be able to take that seat. I'm learning from my experiences with people who feel upset by not being invited. I'm reaching out to everyone, asking if you would like to be a part of this class where we train people on the negotiation skills. We train people to ask for and look for good benefits plans from the developers. We train people how to talk to developers, how to identify good and bad benefits. We train people to ask for what they really need. The beauty of this national coalition is that we understand what everybody else is getting. You know, people were shocked that we got $15 million in Bridgeport, Connecticut, when there are other folks, let's say in Virginia, who got trees planted, or there were some people in another part of the country who got an actual structure, a health facility. There are other people who got other things. So it's important for us to understand what's out there, what we can possibly get, and then take it back to your own community to see if these things and what the other people are getting is something that we could use and something that we need. The negotiation is really important. In fact, I wrote a letter recently looking for attorneys to help us with our class to teach people about the negotiation process, because the developers come to the table with their lawyers, and oftentimes we don't. So we have to understand that we have to pay for these lawyers, because not many community groups have money from grants where they can hire legal representation. And that's critically important. We need to hire folks who can teach us to understand the actual technology. You know, we might not want to enter into a community benefits agreement. For example, right now, you know, the hydrogen and the carbon sequestration, these are situations that are not advantageous to EJ communities. They're extremely dangerous. We feel that they're experimental. So a lot of communities don't even want to enter into a community benefits agreement, because we feel that there's no benefit to the community in any way, shape, or form. So I would just end my comments by saying I'm happy to have this time off to be able to get a very educated cadre of folks together, so that in the event that we need to negotiate or be at that table, we will bring educated folks at that table who understand the process. We will also know that we need an attorney representing us at the table, so that we don't have to go to an attorney and relay information when the attorney could have been at that table and gotten it firsthand.
Beautifully said. And in the interest of time, I think we'll let Sharon be the mic drop on this conversation. Thank you all so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I learned a lot. I hope the rest of you did as well. And we will follow up with the rest of your questions that we didn't get to individually later. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.